Roy Lichtenstein is noted for his use of comics, right, as a subject matter in pop art. So this gets into what Calvin and Hobbes were talking about in the comic I showed you. What is high art, what is low art? And for many, comics were considered low art. It wasn't real art. So Lichtenstein was like, okay, well, let's think about how can we transform subject matter into something elevated, into something high. So his works rotate around comics. He also does a lot of pieces dealing with consumer objects, similar to what we just saw with Oldenburg and Van Bruggen. And I think what he's trying to do is consider, how to shock people in the gallery and make them say, "Well, I could get this in a newspaper. Why am I looking at something that costs this amount of money, right? In a gallery?" To sort of suspend their disbelief about what could be art subject matter, right? And he was a screen printer, so he actually was using a printmaking method. And we'll talk about with both Lichtenstein and Warhol. I think the use of screen printing was actually purposeful because they were saying, art isn't about uniqueness. Art is about something that can be replicated, just like, that can of soup can be made in thousands and thousands and thousands, quantities. Basically, my art can also be the same. And they didn't feel threatened by this idea of replication. They seem to be saying, this is our life now. It's about automation, right? So he was a screen printer. Warhol will also be a screen printer, and I'll discuss that with him as well. And one of the techniques you'll see that Lichtenstein actually uses in the prints is he uses the technique called Bende dots, which is how comics in the newspaper are printed, where it's these little dots, these pixelated dots that kind of add up to create the coloration, right, of the comic when you see it printed in color. And so he actually took great pains to actually replicate the look of that method to make it look just like a comic, make it look like it's been printed right in on a piece of newsprint, essentially. So he was thinking very much about process, right? And replication of that process. So you can see it's very subtle in all his works, but there it is, right? So he seemed to be exploring this idea of the look and the subject matter of comics. He uses a lot of women in his works, and a lot of it is like women sort of on the verge, right? Women who are have come up against a wall. He used a lot of World War II material because again that was popular in comics at the time, just like you saw with the last piece. And so you see him kind of replicating certain themes again and again, and there's sometimes like this sense of a cliffhanger because the comics were always about cliffhanging. They sort of would leave you at the end of a edition kind of saying, oh, what's going to happen? Now I have to buy the next, issue, right, of the comic to find out what happened, right? So a lot of his works, you notice they'll sort of preface themselves on a cliffhanger, like, something is going to happen or something is going to happen or what's going to occur. So always sort of like left hanging. I had mentioned before that the New Orleans Museum of Art is a great place to go. And if you want to see a big, huge Liechtenstein sculpture, definitely check out the New Orleans Museum of Art. They have this big brushstroke right at the roundabout, right as you come up and drive up towards the museum. So that's fun to see there. And I think this piece actually is Liechtenstein kind of poking at abstract expressionism because abstract expressionism was all about the idea of like the mark, right? The throwing of paint, the putting down of paint. And so I think, Liechtenstein might have been saying, like, geez, so serious, right? With this piece. So that's something I always ponder a bit. The last pop artist I'm going to show you is my personal favorite. This is Andy Warhol, or Andy Warhola, as he was born. He decided to take the A off his name because he thought it sounded too ethnic, right? Warhol is from where I'm from. He's from the Pittsburgh area. And so I have an affinity for Warhol. I actually attended the opening of the Warhol Museum on the opening night where it was open all night. So I went with my friends during my senior year of high school to the opening right at the Warhol Museum. It was one of those like memories that I always have. So he's a Pittsburgh guy. I'm a Pittsburgh girl. So I love me some Warhol. And this area I'm from, it is very Eastern European. So his name was Warhola. Like I'm actually half Czech, right? So I'm half Czechoslovakian. So this is a very where I'm from. The Pittsburgh area is a very Eastern European place. There's lots of Polish, right? Lots of Czechs like me. There's just a lot. There's a lot of Greeks, right? There's just a lot of Eastern Europeanness there. So that ethnicity sort of is part of who we are. But he was like, that's not marketable. I need to have, in a sense, like a stage name, right? So I'll become Andy Warhol, not Andy Warhola. So I mentioned this story because from the very first days of him being an artist, he's thinking about how to market himself. Warhol, we always say in art history, is one of the first artists to think about how do you really market yourself? How do you take the mechanism of how life works now, which is putting yourself out in the public sphere, and how do you turn that to your benefit? So he's one of the first artists to really think about this. Again, his famous phrase, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. Now I'd say it's more like 15 seconds with YouTube, but you get his point, right? I think if Warhol was still alive, he would adore our culture right now because it's all about Instagramming yourself, Snapchatting yourself, just constantly showing yourself to other people. He would just think this is fascinating, right? Um, and if you look at the way he practiced, he was really thinking about art not as a unique object, but art as an experience, right? And it even comes down to how he made his works, right? He was a screen printer, like Liechtenstein, and he loved screen printing because he said it was about like proving art's really not about a unique object. You can make hundreds of them, right? So, like with his soup cans, you see here, they're all unique in their own way, but it becomes overwhelming. It becomes sameness to you. So, he's like, is art about uniqueness? Is it about sameness? Is it about comfort? Is it about being challenged? He's really, a lot of people try to write Warhol off as being like one note. I'm like, ugh, you don't know Warhol then because he was very deep about the things he was trying to make you think about, right? You have to get past the surface first. And that was his point. You got to get past the surface first. And then you can kind of ask these questions, which are really, really deep. So he's like, is this unique? Is it not unique? Does it matter? He actually had a whole group of people that made art for him called the Factory. you know, so he would actually create the original screen print, right, and then basically hand it off to other people to make. If this isn't automation, I don't know what is, right? So he was like, I'm making art that's automated with subject matter that's also automated because soup can't just go down an assembly line. It's masterful, right? And what it is. So he's like, I'm gonna call it the factory, right? And if you actually follow Warhols at auction, like when they go up for auction at Christie's or at Sotheby's, these big art houses where they auction artwork off, there's always a question of did Warhol actually make this Warhol? Or was this Warhol made by his assistants? Which I think is just brilliant, right? And it's worth more, of course, if you can prove that the provenance or where it came from is Warhol. It's worth less if the factory made it, right? So it is intriguing to know that maybe your Warhol is not as much Warhol as someone else's Warhol, right? So that's lots of fun to me. And his subjects, again, he really pulls from consumerism. He pulls from what we buy, what we look at, what we consume. And so, of course, his famous soup cans, right? In the classroom on the wall, I have a soup can, and often people are like, "You picked that?" I'm like, Warhol's brilliant. He really is framing for you what we care about in 20th century, in 21st century life. That's he's telling you that, right? I'm like, yeah, I have a Warhol. Yeah, what of it, right? I think he's brilliant. But here you have not just the singular soup can, but you have a panel of them, right? It's this overwhelming soup, 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 soup. And I think, what I take away from this is it's very much like abstract expressionism. It has that all over quality. It's just changing up the subject, right? Here it's consumer objects, there it's about paint. It's about making you think about how you get barraged, with advertising. They've done studies. If you see an ad like 10, 15 times, suddenly you're like, oh, maybe that's something I need. It's a psychological study. If you were barraged by something over and over and over again, unless you're very strong-willed, they've found that most people are like, "Well, maybe I do like Campbell's soup, maybe I do wanna buy this." And you don't really know why besides you've been told that that's what you want, right? So, I think he's navigating through all these webs of how we process information as humans, right? How we make our decisions about buying, why we attach ourselves to something like Coca-Cola, like, "Well, that's better than, the store brand." Why, right? I remember when I first met my husband and we were going to give a party for all our friends, kind of just everyone come together, we'll have a little party. And we went shopping and we're in Publix and I'm just putting like, the Publix brand soda in the cart. And he looks at me and he's like, well, we're having a party. Like, shouldn't we buy Coke? Should we buy Sprite? Like, and I looked at him, I was like, why? And he's like, well, isn't that what people expect? I'm like, well, why? I said, it's basically the same soda, just in different bottles. What, we have to impress people because we bought Coke, but notice that this is about social positioning, right? And again, I was actually telling him the truth because if you know anything about off brands, Publix, any other kind of off brand, It's basically something that they've made a deal with a corporate company to have it rebottled into their bottle. So it's the same damn thing. It's just in a different bottle. So I'm probably getting Pepsi, but it's, it's the off brand, right? Again, it's interesting that we're so governed by what will people think, right? Or what's the name brand here, right? Now, of course, he's just like me. He's like, why the hell would I care about a name brand? I'm like, exactly, right? Um, again, but consumerism is about making you want something, making you attached to something when, it may just be the same darn thing in a different bottle. So it's interesting to consider. Warhol also was very obsessed with celebrity and how celebrity impacts how we live our lives. Um, and really, if you think about the 1950s, 1960s, this is when the American celebrity machine really started to ramp up to where it is today, where we're just obsessed with people we don't even know in person, right? And Warhol himself was a celebrity. So he was thinking about, how am I a celebrity? How are these other people celebrities? And why are we celebrities? And he came to the conclusion, you're a celebrity because you are a celebrity. You're famous for being famous. Like he would love the Kardashians, right? He'd love this idea of like they don't do anything; they're just famous for being famous. So he started to make pieces of famous people from his time, like Liz Taylor or Marilyn Monroe. Today, of course, it'd probably be our Kardashian or Jennifer Lopez, right? Or Lady Gaga or something. Those would be the celebrities he might be using today if he was making these pieces. Now, one thing I want to say about them is notice how he makes them look like Byzantine icons. If you don't know Byzantine icons, go Google it. They were basically religious imagery where you'd have like the saint or the Virgin Mary, and you'd have them on these gold backgrounds. Byzantine people loved gold, right? And so to me, he's making new icons for our celebrity obsessed age. This is our new religion, right? These are the people we worship now. So I'm always very intrigued about his method. And, again, he's Eastern European, so he comes from a very Christian centric background. His family was actually Greek Orthodox. And they were the people who made icons, right? Greek Orthodox religion is the people that had Byzantine icons. So he's using, I think, his background again to kind of think about this idea. Here is Marilyn diptych, and if you even know the word diptych, it's a religious kind of word because these are altar pieces. Diptychs were altar pieces you'd see in churches with two panels. Triptychs had three, polyptychs had many, right? So he's using the setup of a religious object, right? And again, reframing the subject matter to present it to you. He was very obsessed with making people into celebrities. Like if you've ever researched Edie Sedgwick, um, this was a woman that became part of his factory and became someone who appeared in his movies. That's something we're not spending a lot of time with, but Warhol was famous for his movies and reinventing the narrative flow of movies, right? Um, so he'd find these people, he'd pluck them from obscurity, and then he would reframe them as a star. And so I just, I love thinking about how he considers celebrity. In the 16 Jackies, I always look at it now and I always think of like Snapchats or Instagram photos, right? The way we present ourselves to the world and the different moods we give to people and how we frame how we look. Um, Not as popular, but he really had a lot of obsession with disaster and death. You don't see this as much when people talk about Warhol. He himself had kind of a very very sickly persona. He had actually what was called Saint Vitus's dance, and it gave you seizures. So he was very sickly himself, and then he actually was shot by Valerie Solanas and was very injured. And so you can look at the Valerie Solanas shooting as something that also made him very obsessed with like the idea of disaster, death, right? So these are some of the pieces he did about that. And I think, to close off our discussion of pop art, I think one of the things that Warhol gets into is that life is a very banal thing for the most part. We try to pretend it's exciting. We try to pretend it's like woo, but if you think about your day to day, it's pretty banal, as we put it. It's pretty boring. You pay bills, you get up, you brush your teeth, right? It's just maybe not as exciting as we'd like to think it is. So I think in his works, he's also exploring this, especially in his movies. He did a movie called Empire State Building, and it basically was just him filming the Empire State Building for 12 hours straight. That's it. That's all it was. So, again, him dealing with sort of the banality of life. Obviously, don't worry about this, right?